There's a clay tablet sitting in drawer 47B of the British Museum. Catalog number K3751. Most archaeologists who work there walk past it every day without giving it a second glance. Those who do study it rarely discuss what it says in public. I'm going to tell you why. This tablet, covered in wedge-shaped cuneiform impressions, lists 8 rulers who governed before a catastrophic flood swept the world clean. But here's what makes your skin crawl when you actually read the translations. These weren't normal reigns. The shortest, 18,600 years. The longest, 43,200 years. Together, these 8 kings presided over human civilization for a combined 241,200 years. Now, before you click away thinking this is just ancient mythology, let me show you something that will change how you see those numbers forever. In 2010, researchers at the University of Adelaide published findings that shook evolutionary biology to its core. They analyzed DNA from over 1,000 ancient humans whose bones spanned 45,000 years of history. What they discovered was evidence of more than 50 hard sweeps in the human genome, catastrophic genetic events where rare variants spread through entire populations because everyone without them died out. But here's the part that connects to those impossible reign lengths. When they compared ancient genomes to modern ones, they found that we've lost genetic information. We're not just different from our distant ancestors. We're diminished. Entire sequences of DNA that once existed in the human genome have simply vanished from the modern population. What if those impossible numbers on the Sumerian King List weren't mythology at all? What if they were documentation, written in a numerical system we no longer understand, recording an uncomfortable truth about what humanity once was and what we've become? The ancient Sumerians who created the first cities, invented writing itself, left us more than myths. They left us medical procedures that shouldn't have been possible with their technology. Astronomical calculations precise enough to track planetary orbits. And detailed accounts of beings they called the Anunnaki, who they said descended from the heavens and created humanity through what reads, disturbingly, like genetic engineering. These weren't primitive people recording fantasies. They were sophisticated astronomers whose mathematical system we still use to measure time. When they recorded 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle, they weren't guessing. So tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey. Not to distant galaxies or alternate dimensions, but somewhere closer and perhaps more unsettling, into the possibility that we are living as shadows of what humanity was designed to be. That somewhere in our deep past, crucial elements of human capability were deliberately switched off, suppressed, or bred out of our species. And that the keys to understanding what we lost might be hidden in the oldest stories we have, written by people who witnessed something we can barely imagine. Before we go deeper, a quiet like helps others find these stories. I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from tonight? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. The visuals here are just context. You won't need them for this journey. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the ancient world emerge in your mind's eye, in the space between memory and history, where the most profound truths often hide. Let's begin. Let's start with what we know we've lost. Not what ancient tablets claim, but what modern science has proven. The 2010 University of Adelaide study I mentioned wasn't some fringe research published in a questionable journal. This was peer-reviewed, published in legitimate scientific literature, and it revealed something that mainstream science has quietly acknowledged but rarely discusses publicly. More than 50 hard sweeps in the human genome. Let me explain what that actually means, because it's terrifying when you think about it. A hard sweep is a dramatic genetic event where a rare genetic variant rapidly spreads through an entire population because everyone without it dies. Not gets sick, not struggles, dies. Their genetic lineage ends completely. Think about what that means for a moment. More than 50 times in our species' history, the environment changed so drastically that only humans carrying specific genetic mutations survived to pass on their genes. Everyone else, entire genetic lineages, entire populations, perished. These weren't gentle evolutionary nudges. These were catastrophic filters that wiped out huge swaths of human genetic diversity. But here's the remarkable part that connects directly to those ancient tablets describing impossibly long reigns. When researchers compared ancient genomes to modern ones, they found that many of these hard sweep signals had been erased from the contemporary human population. The genetic diversity that once existed in our ancestors, the variations that allowed some of them to survive these catastrophic events, has largely vanished from modern humans. We're genetically more uniform now than our ancestors were 10,000 years ago. We've lost capabilities encoded in DNA that we no longer possess. Around the same time, another research team made an equally startling discovery. They were studying ancient DNA from southern Africa and found people who lived there more than 2,000 years ago had dramatically different genetic makeups than any modern human population. The team described it as representing an extreme end of human genetic variation. These weren't a different species. They were anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, just like us. But their DNA was so distinct from ours that it suggests they had been isolated, evolving separately, for upward of 100,000 years. What happened to them? Their genetic lineage didn't survive into the present. It simply ended. An entire branch of humanity gone. Then there's the case discovered in Bolivia. Researchers found bones from people who lived in the Altiplano around 6,000 years ago. When they sequenced the DNA from these remains, they discovered something that shouldn't be possible. The genetic signatures didn't match any other ancient or modern population in South America. These people appeared in the genetic record, built a civilization, transitioned from hunting and gathering to agriculture, and then vanished completely. No modern descendants. No genetic trace in living populations. They existed. They thrived. And then they were simply erased from the human story. Modern genetics shows us that before modern humans spread out from Africa, they lost approximately 15.8 million DNA base pairs. As populations migrated to different continents, more chunks of DNA disappeared. We didn't just evolve. We shed genetic information. Now, the academic explanation is straightforward. Genetic diversity decreases naturally as populations intermix, as dominant genetic variants outcompete others, and as populations go through genetic bottlenecks where only a small number of individuals survive to repopulate the species. It's normal evolutionary biology. Except the pattern we're seeing isn't quite normal. The speed at which we've lost genetic diversity, the uniformity of modern populations compared to ancient ones, and the complete disappearance of certain genetic lineages suggests something more than natural selection at work. What if it wasn't just natural? What if there was a guiding hand, deliberately selecting which genetic variations would persist and which would be allowed to die out? And what if the answer to that question is carved into clay tablets that have been sitting in museum drawers for over a century, dismissed as mythology because the truth they contain is too disturbing to accept? Let's return to that clay tablet in the British Museum, because the numbers recorded there tell a story that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain. The Weld-Blundell Prism, as it's officially known, is an 8-inch tall clay artifact covered on all four sides with columns of cuneiform script. It's one of the most complete versions of what scholars call the Sumerian King List, a document that purports to record every ruler of ancient Sumer from the moment kingship descended from heaven until around 1763 BCE. The list is organized into two distinct sections, divided by a single catastrophic event. Before the flood, after the flood. Let me read you exactly what the antediluvian section, the part describing rulers before the Great Deluge, actually says. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. Enmengalana ruled for 28,800 years. Dumuzi, the shepherd, ruled for 36,000 years. Ensepetzadana ruled for 28,800 years. Enmendarana ruled for 21,000 years. Ubertutu ruled for 18,600 years. When you add them all together, these 8 antediluvian kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. Then the text states, simply and matter-of-factly, the flood swept over. After the flood, the list continues with new kings and new cities. But something fundamental has changed. The reigns are different. The first king after the flood, ruling from the city of Kish, reigned for 1,200 years. Still impossibly long by our standards, but a dramatic reduction from the tens of thousands of years recorded before. As you move down the list, the numbers continue to shrink. Eventually, you reach names that historians can cross-reference with other archaeological evidence, kings whose reigns match plausible human lifespans. Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, appears on the list with a reign of 126 years. Still extraordinary, but within the realm of extreme possibility. By the time the list reaches its conclusion, the reigns have settled into normal human spans, decades rather than centuries. This progression is what makes the Sumerian King List so compelling. If the entire document were fantastical mythology, why would the pattern change so dramatically at the flood? Why not maintain the extraordinary numbers throughout? The list seems to be documenting a transition, a fundamental shift in the nature of human existence. Now, mainstream scholars offer several explanations, and we need to address them head-on. Explanation number 1. The enormous antediluvian numbers are symbolic, representing political legitimacy by connecting historical dynasties to an impossibly ancient past. Explanation number 2. The Sumerians used a base 60 mathematical system. Some researchers suggest the numbers might have been recorded incorrectly, that a scribe converting from an earlier decimal system to the sexagesimal system might have multiplied everything by 60, inflating normal human lifespans into these impossible figures. Scholar Raul Lopez has argued that if you divide the antediluvian reign lengths by a factor of 60, and then compare them to the ages given in the biblical Genesis account of patriarchs before the flood, the numbers align remarkably well. What the Sumerians recorded as 28,800 years could have been 480 years. Still extraordinary, but closer to the 900-year lifespans recorded in Genesis for figures like Adam and Methuselah. But here's what's fascinating. The Sumerian King List isn't unique. Parallel traditions exist in completely unrelated cultures. The biblical Genesis account describes patriarchs living for hundreds of years before the flood, with lifespans dropping precipitously afterward. Ancient Egyptian king lists record pharaohs ruling for thousands of years in the distant past. Hindu traditions speak of rulers during different yugas, ages, living for tens of thousands of years. Japanese imperial chronicles claim early emperors ruled for over a century. These stories span different continents, different languages, different writing systems, and different cosmologies. Yet they all share the same basic pattern. Rulers or important figures in the distant past lived far longer than any modern human. Then something changed, and lifespans crashed to normal levels. From the mainstream perspective, this is simply evidence of a universal human tendency to mythologize the past, to imagine a golden age when heroes were greater, wiser, and lived longer than we do now. It's poetry, not history. But what if these accounts are fragmented memories of something real? What if there was a time when certain humans did live for centuries, not through magic or mythology, but through biological engineering? And what if the flood that divides the antediluvian period from the post-diluvian isn't just a massive deluge of water, but a metaphor for a catastrophic reset? A moment when the old world ended and a new, diminished humanity emerged. The Sumerians left us more than king lists. They left detailed creation accounts, stories of how humanity came to be. And when you read these texts without the filter of assuming their primitive mythology, they read remarkably like descriptions of genetic engineering. The most complete version of the Sumerian creation story comes from a text called Atrahasis, named after the flood hero who appears in it. Later versions were preserved in Babylonian and Akkadian, but the core story is Sumerian, dating back to at least 1800 BCE, and likely based on much older oral traditions. The story begins not with humans, but with the gods. specifically with a labor dispute. The Anunnaki, described as the great gods, the princely offspring who came from the heavens, had established operations on Earth. They needed to perform massive infrastructure work, digging out the beds for the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, creating irrigation canals, building cities. This work was assigned to a class of lesser gods called the Igigi, for what the text describes as 40 years, or in some translations, 3,600 years, or 40 shars, a shar being a period of 3,600 years. The Igigi performed this backbreaking labor. Finally, they could take no more. They burned their tools. They surrounded the house of Enlil, the chief administrator of the Earth Project, and they went on strike. They refused to work any longer. The Anunnaki Council convened to address the crisis. Enlil, true to his authoritarian nature, wanted to punish the rebels severely. But Enki, his half-brother, the god of wisdom and fresh water, proposed a different solution. Instead of punishing the Igigi, he suggested they create a substitute workforce, a new being designed specifically to perform the labor the Igigi refused to do. And here's where the story becomes remarkable. The text describes the creation of this being, called the Lulu, the Mixed One, in explicit detail that sounds nothing like divine magic and everything like a biological engineering procedure. First, they needed raw material. Enki called for clay to be taken from the Abzu, his domain of subterranean fresh water. But this wasn't just any clay. It had to be pure, mixed with the essence of the earth. This would be the base, the biological template. But the new creature needed more than form. It needed intelligence, the capacity to understand and follow instructions. For this, the text says a god had to be sacrificed. A deity named Gesh-tu-e, described as having intelligence, was selected. His essence, specifically described as his blood and his spirit, was to be mixed with the clay. The mother goddess Nintu, also called Ninhursag, was assigned the task. She took the divine essence and mixed it with the clay from the Abzu. The text describes her dividing this mixture into 14 portions. 7 were used to create males, 7 for females. But here's the detail that makes modern readers sit up. These portions weren't simply animated by divine breath or magic. They were implanted. The text describes 14 womb goddesses, birth goddesses who received these prepared samples and carried them through a gestation period. After the appointed time, Nintu announced her success. The first humans were born. Read that sequence again. Taking genetic material from one species, a primitive hominid, the clay from Earth, mixing it with genetic material from another species, the blood and essence of Gesh-tu-e, implanting the resulting hybrid into surrogate mothers waiting for a gestation period, the birth of a new species. This isn't metaphor. This isn't poetic language about divine breath animating clay. This is a step-by-step description of in vitro fertilization and genetic manipulation. The only reason we don't immediately recognize it as such is because the Sumerians didn't have words for DNA, embryo, genome, or laboratory. They used the vocabulary they had. Clay, for biological material, divine blood, for genetic essence, birth goddesses, for surrogates. The text is explicit about the purpose of this creation. The Lulu were designed to bear the workload of the gods. They were created as a slave species, intelligent enough to understand complex tasks, but engineered specifically to serve their creators without question. This account, recorded in cuneiform on clay tablets that survived in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities, predates the biblical Genesis account by at least 1,000 years. And while Genesis simplified the story, describing God forming Adam from the dust of the ground and breathing life into him, the underlying structure is the same. Humanity was created by a higher intelligence, using the raw material of Earth combined with a divine element. Now, I need to address the elephant in the room. Zecharia Sitchin, the controversial author who brought the Anunnaki narrative to popular attention in the 1970s, proposed that this story wasn't mythology at all. He argued that the Anunnaki were a physically real species extraterrestrial visitors from a planet called Nibiru, whose elliptical orbit brought it through our solar system every 3,600 years. These beings, he claimed, came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago, established mining operations to extract gold, needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere, genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their own DNA with that of Homo erectus, a hominid species already evolving on Earth. Mainstream scholarship has thoroughly rejected Sitchin's theories. Experts point out that his translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts are often idiosyncratic, that he quotes passages out of context, and that he imposes a modern technological framework onto ancient spiritual narratives. The academic consensus is clear. The Anunnaki were gods, deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. The creation stories are theological and mythological, not historical documentation of genetic engineering. But here's what the mainstream dismissal doesn't quite explain. Why would ancient scribes, practical people who used writing primarily for accounting and administration, tracking grain supplies and calculating taxes, invest enormous effort in creating elaborate fantasies? Why describe the creation process in such specific procedural detail if it's pure invention? And there's another question that should make you uncomfortable. If these stories are mythology, why do they include elements that only make sense in light of modern genetic science? The Sumerians couldn't have known about DNA, couldn't have understood heredity in molecular terms, couldn't have conceived of genetic hybridization, yet their creation account describes taking material from two different sources, combining them in a controlled environment, implanting the result in surrogates, producing viable offspring. That's not how ancient people typically imagined creation. That's how modern scientists actually create transgenic organisms. If we entertain, even hypothetically, the possibility that the Sumerian accounts contain distorted memories of real genetic engineering, we need to ask, what capabilities might have been deliberately designed into early humans, and then later suppressed or bred out? Let's start with the most obvious: longevity. The pattern documented in both the Sumerian King List and the biblical Genesis is unmistakable. Extremely long lifespans before the flood, dramatically shortened lifespans afterward. If the Anunnaki created humans as a worker species, long lifespans would make practical sense. Training a workforce is expensive and time-consuming. A human who lives for 900 years and remains productive for 800 of them represents a much better return on investment than one who lives for 80 years with perhaps 50 productive years. Modern genetics has identified genes that regulate aging and lifespan. The FOXO3 gene, for instance, is strongly associated with longevity in multiple human populations. People with certain variants of this gene live significantly longer than average and show reduced rates of age-related disease. There are genes that regulate cellular senescence, the process by which cells stop dividing and contributing to tissue repair. There are genes involved in telomere maintenance, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with each cell division, like a biological countdown timer. What if early humans were engineered with optimal versions of these genes? What if their telomeres were designed to shorten much more slowly, or even to regenerate, allowing cells to divide many more times before reaching senescence? What if their cellular repair mechanisms were enhanced? Their resistance to oxidative damage increased? Their susceptibility to age-related protein misfolding reduced? You could engineer a human to live for centuries using genetic tools that, at least theoretically, we're developing right now. We're still decades away from actually doing it, but the science is sound. Modify the right genes and you extend lifespan. Not infinitely, there are hard limits imposed by physics and entropy, but certainly far beyond our current 80-year average. Now, consider what happened after the flood. In the Atrahasis epic, after the deluge recedes and the surviving humans emerge, the text describes Enlil, the administrator who originally wanted humanity destroyed, making a decree. He establishes new rules for human civilization. And buried in those rules is a curious detail. He institutes death, sickness, and limits on fertility. He specifically states that humanity will no longer live as long as before. If we read this literally rather than symbolically, it describes a deliberate biological intervention. The long-lived variety of humanity is gone, swept away by the flood. What remains is a modified version with built-in limitations. Shorter lifespans, increased susceptibility to disease-controlled fertility. This could be accomplished through selective breeding. You don't need to perform surgery on every human. You just need to ensure that only the humans with the genes you want reproduce. Within a few generations, the long-lived genetic variants are gone from the population. The hard sweep is complete, but longevity might have been the least of what was lost. Deep in the center of your brain, nestled between the two hemispheres, sits a small pine cone-shaped gland about the size of a grain of rice. Modern medicine knows it primarily as an endocrine organ that produces melatonin, regulating your sleep-wake cycle. But to ancient cultures across the world, this tiny structure was something far more significant. The seat of the soul, the third eye, the gateway between physical reality and spiritual dimensions. The ancient Egyptians called it the Eye of Horus. Hindu tradition identifies it with the Ajna chakra, the center of intuition and insight. Buddhist practices focus on it as crucial for meditation and spiritual awakening. The philosopher René Descartes believed it was the principal seat of the soul, the point of connection between mind and body. Why did so many completely unconnected traditions fixate on this particular part of the brain? Because unlike most brain structures, the pineal gland is singular. You don't have a left and right pineal gland like you have left and right hemispheres. It sits alone at the center, outside the blood-brain barrier, making it uniquely susceptible to chemicals in the bloodstream, but also uniquely positioned to integrate information from both sides of the brain. Evolutionary biology tells us the pineal gland is a vestigial third eye, a photoreceptor that in ancient vertebrates sat exposed on top of the skull, detecting light directly. Some modern reptiles still have this structure, a literal third eye on top of their head that helps regulate circadian rhythms. In mammals, including humans, this structure migrated deep into the brain and transformed. But it retained photosensitive cells and maintains deep connections to the visual system. Here's where it gets interesting. The pineal gland produces more than just melatonin. Researchers have found that it also synthesizes small amounts of dimethyltryptamine, DMT, often called the spirit molecule. This is one of the most powerful psychoactive compounds known to science, capable of producing profound alterations in consciousness, vivid hallucinations, what users consistently describe as encounters with otherworldly entities and dimensions. The pineal gland produces DMT during extreme physiological states, possibly during birth, definitely during death, potentially during deep meditative states. The exact function of endogenous DMT production remains mysterious, but its association with the pineal gland and its effects on consciousness have led to intense speculation about the gland's role in psychic phenomena. Esoteric traditions maintain that an activated, healthy pineal gland enables abilities that modern science classifies as paranormal. Clairvoyance, the ability to perceive information beyond ordinary sensory input, telepathy, direct mind-to-mind communication without speech, precognition, sensing future events before they occur, astral projection, the experience of consciousness separating from the physical body. Mainstream science dismisses these claims as pseudoscience, pointing out that there's no verified evidence of psychic abilities under controlled laboratory conditions. But here's a curious historical footnote. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in parapsychology research. The CIA ran programs with names like Stargate, investigating whether remote viewing, the ability to psychically perceive distant locations, could be developed as an intelligence-gathering tool. The program ran for over 20 years and cost millions of dollars. The official conclusion, released when the program was declassified, was that remote viewing showed some statistically significant results, but was too unreliable for practical intelligence use. Too unreliable doesn't mean impossible. It means inconsistent, and that raises an interesting possibility. What if psychic abilities aren't fantasy, but rather dormant capabilities that most modern humans can't access because the biological structures that enable them have been compromised. The compromise has a name: calcification. Studies using CT scans and MRI imaging have found that the majority of adults over the age of 18 have calcified pineal glands. Calcium deposits, sometimes with phosphate and fluoride, accumulate in the gland, forming a hard shell around the tissue. The more calcified the pineal gland, the less melatonin it produces, and presumably the less DMT and other neurochemicals that might facilitate expanded states of consciousness. What causes this calcification? The research points to several factors. Fluoride in drinking water and dental products is strongly associated with pineal calcification. The gland sits outside the blood-brain barrier, making it uniquely vulnerable to accumulating toxins from the bloodstream. Dietary calcium from processed foods, particularly calcium phosphate additives, contributes to the buildup. Electromagnetic radiation from wireless devices and electrical fields may interfere with the gland's function, and simply not using the capacities the gland might enable allows it to atrophy and calcify. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the pineal gland of adepts, spiritual practitioners who underwent intensive training, as being the size of a peach rather than a pea. Modern humans have pineal glands that are, on average, significantly smaller and heavily calcified compared to what the organ's full potential might be. If the Anunnaki engineered humans as a worker species, they would have had an incentive to suppress abilities that might allow their creations to communicate, telepathically perceive events, remotely access higher states of consciousness that might lead to questioning their servitude. The easiest way to do this wouldn't be to remove the pineal gland entirely. That might have caused other physiological problems. The elegant solution would be to introduce environmental and dietary factors that cause the gland to calcify naturally, to limit its function without eliminating it completely. And if you wanted to ensure this calcification occurred in subsequent generations, you would establish it as standard practice. Introduce fluoride into the water supply, ostensibly for dental health. Promote dietary habits that lead to calcium accumulation. Create a technological society that bathes everyone in electromagnetic radiation. Frame meditation and psychic development as superstition or fantasy, ensuring people never attempt to activate the capacities the pineal gland might enable. You don't need a vast conspiracy for this to occur. If the original genetic engineering included a vulnerability to calcification, if early post-flood humans discovered that certain environmental factors promoted it and embedded those factors into their civilization, the process would be self-sustaining. Each generation would unwittingly continue the suppression, believing they were simply following sensible health and technological practices. Every ancient tradition that mentions diminished human capabilities associates it with a flood event. The Sumerian King List places it between the antediluvian super-long reigns and the post-diluvian shorter ones. Genesis places it between the patriarchs who lived 900 years and their descendants who lived progressively shorter lives. Hindu tradition associates the shift between yugas with periodic destructions, including massive floods. Greek myths describe multiple catastrophic floods that reset civilization. Geology and archaeology have found extensive evidence of massive flooding events in human history. The end of the last ice age, around 11,600 years ago, involved rapid melting of glaciers and significant sea level rise. The Black Sea flood hypothesis suggests that the Mediterranean breached the Bosporus Strait around 5,600 BCE, transforming a freshwater lake into the Black Sea and inundating coastal settlements. Massive megafloods occurred repeatedly as glacial dams broke and released huge volumes of water. But the floods described in ancient texts seem to be more than just water. They're described as cosmic events, resets of reality itself. In the Sumerian account, the Anunnaki gods themselves are terrified by the flood, cowering at the highest point of heaven. In the biblical account, the flood is described as the fountains of the great deep bursting forth and the windows of heaven opening, suggesting not just rain, but a fundamental disruption of the cosmic order. Some researchers have proposed that these accounts might be describing something other than a literal flood, a catastrophic event that was experienced and remembered as a flood because water was one obvious effect, but that involved much larger changes to the planet or even to reality itself. One theory involves a pole shift, a rapid change in Earth's magnetic field or rotational axis that would cause massive climate disruption, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and flooding, widespread electromagnetic effects, disruption of circadian rhythms, potential neurological impacts on all life. If the Earth's magnetic field suddenly weakened or shifted, cosmic radiation would increase dramatically. This could cause genetic mutations, damage to DNA, potential activation or deactivation of genetic sequences. Another theory suggests a massive solar event, a coronal mass ejection or solar storm of unprecedented magnitude that stripped away part of Earth's atmosphere, caused global wildfires, disrupted the planet's electromagnetic environment. Ancient accounts describe the sky burning, the sun becoming dark, the stars falling from heaven, all of which could be descriptions of atmospheric phenomena associated with a massive solar event. A third theory, more aligned with the ancient astronaut hypothesis, suggests the flood was a deliberately engineered reset, that the Anunnaki, observing that their genetic creation had gotten out of control, perhaps through interbreeding with the Watchers or through spontaneous genetic changes, decided to start over. They used their technology to trigger a catastrophe, perhaps by manipulating Earth's orbit, disrupting the ice caps, or employing weapons we can barely conceive, and then carefully preserved genetic samples of the humans they wanted to continue while allowing the old population to be destroyed. The biblical account of Noah's Ark explicitly describes preserving breeding pairs of animals and a single human family. If you wanted to perform a genetic bottleneck on the human population, to eliminate unwanted genetic variants and restart with only the lineages you approve, that's exactly how you do it. Preserve the genetic material you want, destroy everything else, repopulate from the preserved samples. The post-flood world, in this interpretation, is humanity 2.0. The same basic species, but with specific genetic modifications. Shorter lifespans, reduced cognitive abilities, diminished access to psychic faculties, built-in limitations that weren't present in the original model. All ancient traditions agree that after the flood, something fundamental changed. The direct connection between humans and the divine was severed, or severely attenuated lifespans crashed. The age of heroes ended. Civilization had to rebuild from scratch. Whether this was a natural catastrophe that eliminated the most advanced populations and left only scattered survivors, or a deliberate culling designed to reset the human experiment, the result was the same. The world after the flood was diminished, and we are the descendants of that diminished population. Before we explore how to reclaim lost abilities, we need to address one of the most perplexing discoveries in modern genetics, a finding so anomalous that it's been quietly acknowledged in scientific literature but rarely discussed in popular science. In the human genome, there are 223 genes that appear nowhere else in the tree of life. They exist in humans and only in humans. They have no obvious precursors in any other species, including our closest genetic relatives, chimpanzees. When the Human Genome Project was completed in 2003, scientists expected to find that most human genes had clear evolutionary ancestors, that we could trace each gene back through chimpanzees, earlier primates, mammals, vertebrates, all the way to single-celled organisms. And for the vast majority of our genome, that's exactly what they found. Our genes have evolutionary histories. They mutated from earlier versions in ancestral species. But 223 genes couldn't be traced to any precursor. They appeared to have been inserted into the human genome from outside the normal evolutionary tree. The official scientific explanation, published in peer-reviewed journals, is that these genes were likely acquired through horizontal gene transfer from bacteria, that at some point in our evolutionary past, bacterial DNA was incorporated into the germline, the reproductive cells that pass genetic information to offspring, and these bacterial genes became permanent parts of the human genome. This does happen. Viruses and bacteria can insert genetic material into host genomes. About 8% of the human genome consists of endogenous retroviruses, ancient viral infections that became permanent passengers in our DNA. So bacterial gene transfer isn't impossible. It's just extremely rare in complex organisms. and having 223 distinct bacterial genes successfully integrated and maintained is statistically extraordinarily unlikely. Moreover, when you examine what these 223 genes do, they're not random metabolic functions you might expect from bacterial insertions. Many of them are involved in complex neurological functions, cellular signaling, regulatory processes that are distinctly important to what makes humans human. They're not evolutionary baggage. They're active, functional, and relevant. Alternative researchers, including those who support the ancient astronaut hypothesis, point to these 223 genes as potential evidence of genetic engineering. If you wanted to upgrade a hominid species to create something new, you would need to insert novel genetic information. You couldn't rely on random mutation and natural selection alone. Those processes are too slow and too random. You would need to add specific genes that code for the capabilities you want. The mainstream scientific community doesn't seriously entertain this interpretation. The bacterial horizontal transfer explanation, while imperfect, is more parsimonious than invoking extraterrestrial genetic engineers. But the fact remains, we have 223 genes that, from a strictly evolutionary standpoint, shouldn't be there. And we don't have a fully satisfactory explanation for how they got there. There's another genetic mystery that compounds this puzzle: human chromosome 2. All great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have 23 pairs. We're missing a chromosome. Or rather, we're not missing it. It's been fused. Human chromosome 2 is the result of an end-to-end fusion of two smaller ape chromosomes. We can see the fusion site. We can identify the remnants of telomeres, the protective caps that normally exist only at chromosome ends, buried in the middle of chromosome 2 where the fusion occurred. We can see the remnants of two separate centromeres, the structures that normally exist once per chromosome, with one centromere deactivated. This fusion is accepted scientific fact. The question is, why did it happen? Natural chromosome fusions occur occasionally in populations. Usually, they're lethal or cause severe genetic problems. For a fusion to become fixed in an entire species, it has to provide some advantage, or at least not cause problems. And it has to occur in the germline of an individual who then successfully reproduces, and whose descendants eventually replace the non-fused population. The odds of this happening naturally are low. Not impossible, but improbable enough that some researchers have questioned whether the fusion might have been deliberately induced. If you wanted to create a genetic barrier between an engineered species and its wild-type ancestors, ensuring they couldn't interbreed successfully, engineering a chromosome fusion would be an elegant solution. A human with 23 chromosome pairs trying to reproduce with an ape with 24 pairs would face chromosomal incompatibility issues. The resulting offspring would likely have developmental problems or be sterile. It's a built-in reproductive barrier preventing the engineered species from backcrossing with the species it was derived from. Again, mainstream science has a perfectly adequate natural explanation. Chromosome fusions happen. This one happened to an early human ancestor. It didn't cause problems. It spread through the population. End of story. But if you're looking for evidence of deliberate genetic modification, a species-defining chromosome fusion would be exactly the kind of structural change you'd expect to see. Whether human abilities were deliberately suppressed by ancient genetic engineers or simply atrophied through environmental and cultural changes, the practical question remains the same. Can we reclaim them? The answer appears to be yes, at least partially, because unlike genetic changes that require millions of years to reverse, environmental and epigenetic changes can be addressed within a single lifetime. The field of epigenetics has revealed that genes can be switched on or off without changing the underlying DNA sequence. Environmental factors, dietary choices, stress levels, meditation practices, and even thoughts and beliefs can influence which genes are expressed and which remain dormant. This means that capabilities encoded in our DNA but suppressed through environmental or cultural factors can potentially be reactivated within a single generation. Consider documented cases of extreme human performance that seem to transcend normal limitations. Wim Hof, the Dutch extreme athlete, can control his autonomic nervous system through breathing techniques and meditation, surviving in temperatures that should cause hypothermia, influencing his immune response to injected pathogens, and training others to do the same. Scientific studies have confirmed that he's actually doing what he claims, activating physiological systems that medical science believed were entirely autonomous and beyond conscious control. Tibetan monks practicing tummo meditation can raise their core body temperature enough to dry wet sheets wrapped around their naked bodies in freezing conditions. This isn't mythology. It's been documented and studied by Western scientists. The monks aren't using magic. They're using specific breathing and visualization techniques that activate neurological and metabolic pathways most people never access. Memory champions can memorize entire shuffled decks of cards in under a minute, thousands of random digits, enormous amounts of information that should exceed the capacity of human working memory. They're not born with supermemory. They train specific mental techniques that exploit the brain's natural capacity for spatial and visual memory, demonstrating that the limits we assume are absolute are actually just the limits of our current usage patterns. These examples prove that the human nervous system has capabilities far beyond what we typically access. The genetics are there. The neurology is there. What's missing is the knowledge of how to activate these systems, the cultural framework that encourages people to try. In the context of potentially reclaiming suppressed abilities, several practical approaches have emerged, drawing from both ancient wisdom traditions and modern scientific understanding. First, optimizing the internal biological environment. This involves removing the toxins and environmental factors that interfere with optimal neurological and physiological function. Filtering fluoride from drinking water, choosing organic whole foods over processed products laden with additives and preservatives, reducing exposure to heavy metals through careful sourcing of food and water, minimizing electromagnetic radiation exposure by limiting time with wireless devices and creating low EMF sleeping environments. These aren't fringe health practices. They're increasingly supported by mainstream research showing that environmental toxins do accumulate in brain tissue, do interfere with endocrine function, and do have measurable negative effects on cognition and health. Removing them doesn't confer supernatural abilities, but it removes impediments to optimal function. Second, actively stimulating dormant capacities. Meditation has been extensively studied and shown to produce measurable changes in brain structure and function. Long-term meditators show increased thickness in brain regions associated with attention and sensory processing, enhanced connectivity between brain networks, the ability to enter altered states of consciousness at will. These aren't subjective experiences. They're objective, measurable neurological changes. Breathwork practices, from ancient pranayama techniques to the modern Wim Hof method, can profoundly alter physiology, shifting the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, changing blood pH, increasing oxygen delivery to tissues, and potentially producing altered states through controlled hypoxia and hyperoxia. Sensory deprivation, whether through flotation tanks or meditation, removes external stimuli and allows the brain to enter unusual states where the boundary between self and environment becomes permeable, often leading to experiences that users describe as psychic or mystical. Third, decalcifying the pineal gland. This is a process many people are actively pursuing. Reducing exposure to fluoride by filtering drinking water and using fluoride-free dental products, avoiding processed foods with calcium phosphate additives, supplementing with nutrients that help remove heavy metals and calcium deposits. Iodine, magnesium, chlorella, spirulina, cilantro, and certain fulvic and humic acids, reducing electromagnetic exposure where possible, particularly during sleep when the pineal gland is most actively working to stimulate the gland through meditation. Breath work and practices specifically designed to activate the third eye. Reports from people who've successfully decalcified their pineal glands are anecdotal but remarkably consistent. More vivid dreams, often lucid dreams, enhanced intuition, stronger gut feelings that prove accurate more often than chance, occasional telepathic connections with people they're emotionally close to, a sense of expanded awareness and connection to something larger than individual consciousness. Whether these are genuine psychic abilities emerging or neurochemical changes that alter subjective experience is debatable. But the subjective experience is real to the people having it. And subjective experience, one could argue, is the only experience any of us ever have. Fourth, extending health span and lifespan. We're identifying the genes and molecular pathways involved in aging and developing interventions, pharmaceutical, genetic, and lifestyle-based, that show genuine promise. Caloric restriction without malnutrition extends lifespan in nearly every organism studied. Intermittent fasting triggers cellular autophagy-specific exercise protocols activate longevity pathways. Certain pharmaceutical compounds like rapamycin and metformin show lifespan extension in animal models. More radical interventions are being explored. Senolytics, drugs that selectively destroy senescent cells, telomerase activation to prevent chromosome-shortening, partial cellular reprogramming using Yamanaka factors, NAD plus supplementation to restore levels that decline with age. We're not going to see 900-year lifespans in the near future. The engineering challenges are too complex. As your thoughts drift and your breathing slows, let's sit with the deepest question this investigation raises. Not whether the Anunnaki were real or whether our abilities were suppressed, but what it means to be human in the first place. If the materialist scientific view is correct, we're the product of billions of years of evolution, shaped by natural selection into conscious beings capable of understanding our own origins. We're self-aware patterns of matter and energy, temporary configurations of atoms that will eventually dissipate back into the cosmos. This view is neither comforting nor despairing. It simply is what the evidence suggests, and there's a certain austere beauty in it. We're the universe becoming conscious of itself. We're stardust that learned to think. But the alternative view, the one suggested by ancient myths and embraced by various spiritual traditions, is that we're more than biological machines. That consciousness isn't produced by the brain, but rather channeled through it. That we're spiritual beings having a temporary physical experience. That the material world is one layer of a multidimensional reality we can't fully perceive with our limited senses. In this view, the suppression of human abilities isn't primarily genetic. It's perceptual. We've been limited not in our biology, but in our awareness. We've been taught to identify with the physical form, with the thoughts and emotions generated by our neurology, rather than with the deeper consciousness that observes those thoughts and emotions. We've been conditioned to perceive only the material dimension and to dismiss everything else as imagination or delusion. The real suppression in this framework is the forgetting of what we truly are. We're infinite consciousness experiencing limitation. We're divine sparks encased in flesh, playing a cosmic game of forgetting and remembering. And the purpose of the entire exercise is the journey back to remembering. The Anunnaki, in this interpretation, aren't necessarily physical extraterrestrials. They could be beings from higher dimensions, consciousness operating at frequencies we can't normally perceive. Their genetic engineering might not have been biological manipulation, but rather the imposition of perceptual filters, limiting human consciousness to focus on the physical dimension and blocking access to higher awareness. The flood that divides the antediluvian from the post-diluvian wouldn't be water, but a shift in consciousness, a dimensional reset that changed the rules of reality and made it much harder for embodied consciousness to maintain connection with higher frequencies. Both frameworks, the materialist and the spiritual, are internally consistent. Both account for the evidence, though they interpret it very differently. Both offer paths forward for human development. The choice between them isn't one of right and wrong. It's one of resonance. Which framework feels true to you? Which one makes your experience of being human make sense? And here's the deepest secret. It might not be a choice at all. Reality might be large enough to contain both. We might be simultaneously biological machines shaped by evolution and immortal consciousness experiencing limitation, the product of natural processes and the creation of higher intelligence diminished from what we were and exactly what we're meant to be at this stage of our development. The ancient Sumerians, writing on their clay tablets under the stars of Mesopotamia, may have been recording myths, or they may have been documenting genuine history in the only vocabulary they had. We stand too far from those events to know with certainty. But we're close enough to our own experience to know this. You are more than you've been taught to believe. Your consciousness is vaster than your thoughts. Your potential is greater than what you've been told is possible. And somewhere in your genetic code, in your neurology, in your consciousness itself, capabilities sleep that could wake if you knew how to call them. Whether those capabilities were placed there by evolutionary processes, by genetic engineers from another world, or by your own higher self before you incarnated into this particular form, the result is the same. They're there, dormant but not dead, waiting. The question isn't what the Anunnaki did to us thousands of years ago. The question is what you'll do with the seed of potential they, or evolution, or consciousness itself, left within you. Will you accept the limitations you've been taught are absolute? Or will you test them? Will you assume your current state is all you can be? Or will you explore the edges of what's possible? The clay tablets in museum drawers can't answer these questions for you. The genetic sequences in your DNA won't make the choice. The ancient myths point toward mysteries but don't solve them. Only you can decide who and what you're willing to become. And with that thought, let everything else drift away. The Anunnaki and their agendas. The question of what was lost. The possibility of what could be reclaimed. All of it can wait. All of it will still be there tomorrow if you want to explore further. For now, there's only this moment. Your breath moving in and out. Your consciousness floating between waking and sleep. The vast quiet of the universe holding you in its ancient arms. The stories we've explored tonight, whether they're history or myth, all agree on one thing. You're here for a reason. You carry within you something precious. And the journey of discovering what that is has only just begun. So rest now. Let the questions dissolve. Let the mysteries remain mysterious. Let sleep come naturally, knowing that whatever you are, whatever capabilities sleep within you, they're not going anywhere. They've waited thousands of years. They can wait until morning. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well, dream deep, and remember, just for a moment before you slip away completely, that you are so much more than you've been told. Good night.